Now we're going to talk about war and poverty and the link between conflict and hunger. So what is conflict? Conflict is man-made, first off. It's in society. It's all around us. It's a question of degree, oftentimes, of how bad it can get. Definition would be the differences and clashes between needs, interests, perceptions, and activities of actors which are all part of social life. It can be violent or non-violent. It can be extreme, intense. It can be very slight. It can take a number of different forms. Poverty and hunger can both be a cause as well as a consequence of conflict. So people can be fighting over scarce resources, for example, or because they have scarce resources available to them, or they're living in that environment, they then fight, or they are in conflict because of the scarcity. Hunger and violent conflict, of course, can lead to famine, because when societies are disrupted, then there could be less food available. Either people aren't able to grow, they don't have access to the land where they'd like to grow due to fighting or landmines or just basic insecurity, personal, physical insecurity. The markets are not working. In extreme cases, the food supplies have been destroyed. It can run through various stages of escalation, that is conflict. From a stable peace, where there's low levels of conflict, which can be more of a political nature, arguments, lots of raised voices that may not necessarily be physical conflict. Unstable peace, latent conflict, where there's serious underlying issues, where the conflict hasn't burst out into open warfare, but there's peace, but very unstable, and we can see it coming. And again, as we've discussed in previous lectures, these are the kinds of situations that we on the UN side are constantly trying to monitor and understand better, so that we can be prepared for when high tension can lead to open conflict. And then we may be called, we as an agency or as a system in the UN might be called to assist, and in particular help those who are most vulnerable. So what can cause conflict? Conflicts are often caused by opposing interests, often aggravated by social, cultural differences of religion, of class, ethnicity, language, political views within a society, within a community, within a country. Also social, economic, and political inequalities, which can play a major role. Power imbalance, concentration of power in the hands of a few elites who have all resources, all political power, all financial decision-making power. It can be in a situation where you have a government that uses coercive state power to manage the country and to keep certain groups in their place. Again, looking at the first one of opposing interests, coercive state power can play a major role in keeping religion, class, ethnicity, and those various issues all as key issues that different communities fight about, or feel one is favored over the other. And then overall, a competition for resources in certain countries where fertile land perhaps is at a premium, energy resources, water, in some cases the higher land that is less prone to flooding, for example, or the lower land being more fertile. That's a possibility. There are many different aspects of life in communities, in countries, in regions that can cause conflict. So who does conflict involve and affect? So political groups are often those, of course, caught up in the midst of conflict. Ethnic, religious, and language groups, regional groups, class groups, and as always, it's the most vulnerable who are the most affected. That is, again, by definition, vulnerable groups are those without the power. The women, the children, the poorest of the poor. We have a new phenomenon, of course, now with the children of war, the children are most affected being part of the most vulnerable in their families, but then they get recruited as child soldiers where they become a party in the conflict itself. And that complicates matters hugely, obviously, in the family as well. Victimization of women, rape being used as a weapon of war. Basically, poor people without any options who are caught up in the conflict that is then caused by these various factors. So what can trigger conflict? Well, a perception of opportunity, a perception of threat by those who then react, a sense that there is injustice, it's some social injustice, economic injustice. Fear, remember, always can be a very, very powerful weapon. And what we have seen over the years is that the use of media and education to promote the various differences in society can really be most effectively used to feed the fear, to develop that fear to the point where major problems can develop. Different groups are played off each other. One very classic example is in the Rwanda genocide a number of years ago, where we know that the media, the Rwandan radio in particular, was instrumental in exacerbating the ethnic tensions that had already existed between the two key groups, the Hutus and the Tutsi. And there was a conscious effort made by the Rwandan radio to exacerbate those differences and cause a lot of fear against different groups, or incite other groups to attack the same or the different groups. It was back and forth and back and forth. Here's an example that I'm often fond of talking about in extreme cases where you have a government system. I was talking about coercive state power earlier on. Here's an example in Namibia where I was visiting the Ministry of Education, and there, this is in Namibia prior to independence, where the apartheid South African government was in control. It was a South African colony prior to independence in 1990. And you had the administration for whites, administration for coloreds who were mixed race, and then administration for blacks. We had to go to all three. And you can imagine there was this nice building for the whites. The coloreds had a slightly less nice looking building, and the black community much less. And of course they were by far the majority. Huge sense of social injustice on the parts of the communities that we were dealing with that was institutionalized all the way up to the highest levels of government.